They say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Have Europeans made the most of this one? Another last chance summit to save Greece underway, and according to who you believe, it's also a summit to save the euro. Have the fresh faces elected at the start of the year in Athens forced a rethink of the relationship between debtors and creditors? Have lenders taken stock of past errors and come up with clues on how to build a better eurozone? Or should we say a better Europe? This, after all, is an EU summit where all 28 are invited, including those that don't share the common currency. When the UK holds a referendum on leaving Europe at some point, voters will take a hard look at the 16 years since the euro's creation and wonder what the next decade and a half have in store. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if it's all worth it. And with us to talk about it, he is a German who works in Paris, Jakob Hessler, who a startup that works in big data. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
And some other new things. So,
and some other new things.
Healthcare and, yeah.
All right.
Finance.
Business booming.
It's going well.
All right. We'll be asking you, of course, later on if the euro has been good for your business during our discussion. Also with us, Philip Golub, who teaches international affairs at the American University of Paris. Always a pleasure, sir.
Pleasure for me.
And from London, he's the co-director of Open Europe, an advocacy group that says Europe is not working. Raoul Ruparel, many thanks for being with us.
Hi there.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. All comers were warned going in. This summit was not going to be the breakthrough moment. There's movement, though, and rising hopes. Greece can meet its end-of-month deadline for paying off 1.6 billion euros. Tom Waterhouse has the story.
A grey and misty Brussels didn't seem to dampen the Greek Prime Minister's spirits as he arrived for an unprecedented summit to stop his country defaulting and potentially falling out of the Union.
I think this is time for a substantial and viable solution that would allow Greece to come back to growth within the eurozone with social justice and cohesion.
Monday's emergency summit aims to free up 7.2 billion euros that Athens desperately needs to repay a 1.5 billion debt to the IMF due on June the 30th, as well as finance its other repayments due later this summer. Tsipras unveiled a new set of reform and budget proposals on Sunday to appease his European and IMF creditors. They've described the new offer as a positive step forward and a solid and global basis. But work still needs to be done and certain sticking points still remain, notably on pensions and early retirement, value-added tax and budget surplus targets. With much to digest and discuss, many agree it will more likely be no deal than deal on Monday.
This seems to be a little bit of a Monday when we have wasted a lot of air miles both on the finance minister's side and on the prime minister's side, because I don't foresee a breakthrough today.
The German Chancellor was, however, keen to stress that if there's no deal reached this Monday, there is still time. But in Athens, the storm clouds were gathering and the headlines were even more downcast. Speaking of dramatic times, painful deal or bankruptcy.
Jakob Hessler, is it a waste of air miles to show up in Brussels if there's not going to be a deal? The way we heard it there from the Finnish finance minister in that report?
Well, depends on how you value what you attribute the value of diplomacy is. I think it's probably not a waste because they come and they know that they'll give themselves another run until Thursday. So let's wait.
All right. The way it's been described to us by our Brussels correspondent, Raoul Ruparel, those proposals from the Greeks coming in late, so they have to crunch the numbers. They're talking about, according to Greek media, raising VAT, raising the retirement age. We're finally getting into the meat of it, and it's going to mean more pain for the Greeks.
Well, yes, I think at least these proposals are looking to moving towards some kind of a deal. And I think we've heard comments from the European side that these are considered the first real proposals. So that shows you how long it's taken to get where we are. But at least there is some progress being made. But as you suggest, there are still going to be some painful reforms for the Greeks. I think even though the focus has been on austerity, even if we aren't talking about more fiscal cuts, which there may still be some of, but there are some very serious reforms that the Greek economy needs to go through, and there are still going to be some painful choices for the Greek government and the Greek people ahead. So there's no doubt that this is still a very challenging package to agree, not just between Europe and Greece, but also to get through the Greek parliament and then to gain support to implement it on the ground.
Did the Greek Prime Minister misplay his hand?
Well, I think certainly he's made a few miscalculations during these negotiations. The first one was expecting that the threat of Greece leaving the eurozone would force other members to really come round to his point of view and to see it his way. I think another miscalculation has been the sympathy he expected from some of the other countries that have gone through austerity and had similar crises. He had expected support from Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, because they have made such hard choices as well. But in reality, what he found was these countries united against him because they have gone through the tough choices and come out the other side and now on the path to recovery for the large part. So I think he found much less support there. And generally, I think there was a miscalculation in that him and his finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, have made this about economics and about the economic arguments, saying these numbers don't quite stack up and we don't agree with your ideology. But ultimately, I think this is not about ideology. This is about democracy and about politics. A lot of it has been muddling through. It's not as if this was chosen as an ideology which the eurozone embraces entirely. The approach taken in Greece and in other countries has been largely a result of confused democracy and confused politics, and they've done the best they can just to muddle through. So I think he has not really faced up to the democratic and political challenges he faces in trying to push through, say, a debt restructuring, even if the economics he underlies it with makes sense.
Philip Gollum?
Well, I can't disagree more. There's nothing in what you said that I can actually agree with. The Europeans have mismanaged this crisis from the very start. We're not talking about austerity policies in the case of Greece. We're talking about an enforced depression. The GDP of Greece's GDP has fallen by 25% since 2010. Unemployment has risen to 25% of the population, with 60% of the youth being unemployed. Poverty has increased drastically and massively in all of the major urban areas and rural areas of Greece. You're talking about a Great Depression. Actually, if you look at the amplitude of the contraction, it's worse than in the United States during the Great Depression there. None of this was necessary. This was the result of policies that were implemented in a consistent way and on a consistent basis by the European authorities in conjunction with the IMF and the European Central Bank. The IMF itself, in 2012, the chief economist of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, published a very well-known report by now that made clear that the IMF's own calculations, prior calculations as to the effects, the contractionary effects of the austerity programs, the so-called fiscal multiplier, had been entirely miscalculated. They had expected a fall of GDP of at maximum around 10%. GDP has fallen to 25%. They had expected a recovery by 2012. That has not happened. We're talking about an enforced depression, and you can't go much further in these policies without actually cracking the society and creating a failed state. So
should Tsipras be signing on the dotted line?
Tsipras has done, I think, the best that he could possibly do. One can argue about the style, his negotiating tactics, the style of his team, and other things of that type. However, on the fundamentals, he has done the best he possibly could. What has he done? He and Varoufakis and the rest of his government, but primarily he and Varoufakis. They made public, finally, they're the first ones to have made public the debate at political level, in Europe and worldwide about the policies that were being followed. Prior to that, there was a debate about the austerity policies. There was a debate about the macroeconomic policies that Europe should or should not follow, but mainly in elite circles among economists with a certain amount of popular participation that was not heard. There were mass demonstrations in Spain in 2013 and 2012 with hundreds of thousands of people. 10% of the Portuguese population went out and demonstrated in 2012 against the austerity policies there, and they were not heard. What Varoufakis and Tsipras did manage to do was to make this into an open, European-wide
But you just heard Raul
debate.
Ruparel say that they did not win over the sympathy of counterparts from those other countries that you mentioned.
They never. It's not
from
true.
the likes of Spain and Portugal.
It is certainly not the case that Tsipras is so naive that he would have thought that Rajoy in Spain would have supported his policies. There was never any thought that the conservative parties, the conservative political parties in other European countries, even from the peripheral, so-called peripheral south, would ever have followed those policies. What they were hoping for was a certain amount of leniency on the part of France, however. They were hoping that the Hollande government would actually engage in some kind of maneuvering within the European system. And they were hoping also for something on the Italian side. They were not hoping anything from Spain and Portugal and the current Irish leadership.
Jakob Hessler, where do we go from here? Because we're seeing it's looking as though we're going to have some kind of a deal before the end of the month. But what kind of a deal, and what they call an ad minima deal, a deal with a small d?
Well, I think the real question is to dissect the problems that we're looking at. On the one hand, there is a definite need for reform of much of the Greek apparatus, the way it functions, probably the way public officials are being paid, the way that the pension benefits are being distributed, and that independently from any austerity and from the question of how much do you need to choke the system, I mean, ironically speaking, in order to shove that down someone's throat. And so it can be in no one's interest, nowhere, to fragilize the sort of an economy so much. At the same time, and that's the political gambling or bargaining, is what is and how can Europe help? And that's actually the question that they should ask, which is how can they help the Greek government to establish efficient tax collection among those who today don't pay any taxes, which is one of the, I think, main reasons why so many European average middle-class taxpayers are so anti-Greek, which they say, why should I pay with a bailout package for a country that lived beyond its mean? And look, all these people, you go to a doctor in Athens and nobody pays taxes. Why should I pay for it? Now that's, I think, a legitimate question. The question, the problem is, so what is the type of answer that you would need is, well, you need something very basic, which is an efficient tax collection, a simplification of the tax code. Those things takes time. And what I would hope is that if we got out of the primary mess, that we could start talk about what are the very concrete reforms of that nature, and how can we actually help the Greeks get those done, regardless of who is in government, whether it's Tsipras or some other government. Actually, I honestly I don't care, and I think there has been so much trust and personal animosity overshadowing recently this debate that that's the second element I think that they need to work on. Is I think that they need to fix the way they talk to each other, because obviously in diplomacy we are really...
Let's give an example of that
closer.
right now. We heard the words of the Finnish finance minister at the outset of this discussion. Northern Europeans definitely showing impatience, and Jakob Hessler is right. The tone is something to behold. Listen to the German finance minister.
We haven't received any new offers. I believe we are exactly where we were last Thursday. The IMF haven't received anything either, so we need to wait for the three institutions to receive and validate the offers and come up with theirs in agreement with the Greek government, so that we can study it at the Eurogroup. For the moment, though, we've got nothing, so we won't be able to deliver anything at tonight's summit.
What's going to come out of the summit then?
Without real preparation, not much.
This is the blame game, okay? This is the blame game. Who's going to be blamed if ever the eurozone were to break up, one of the members of the eurozone were to be expelled or to leave the eurozone? There's the question of blame. Who's going to be blamed for this? Who's going to be blamed for this historic moment? Merkel does not, obviously Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, does not want to be blamed for a historic first in Europe, which would be the beginning of the breakup of Europe in that way. The Greeks don't want to be blamed. The European Commission doesn't want. There's a blame game going on as to where the responsibilities lie. I would like to say something about the taxpayers. If you look carefully at what has happened over the past 5 years, the European taxpayers haven't paid anything for the moment. All of this has been a circulatory flow in which the funds supposedly go to Greece, but in fact they go right back to the repayment of previous debts. 90% of the funds have gone right back to pay previous debts. Well, when the governments nationalized, the private sector debt, the banks' debt, they were taking care of their own banks, the French banks and the German banks and other banks. So in effect what has happened is that European taxpayers for the moment have lost nothing. Were Greece to default, they would lose a lot. But for the moment they have lost nothing. Moreover, if you look at what happened in the course of the crisis, interest rates have fallen dramatically in so-called core European countries, and in particular Germany, France, Austria, and other countries of this type, all right? Finland also. The German finance ministry itself, I've seen reports for 2012, and I'm extrapolating from them, okay? The German finance ministry itself in 2012 calculated that Germany had saved over 60 billion euros in debt, in interest on its debt, on its governmental public debt. If you extrapolate on that over the past 3 years, you can calculate that it's approximately 120 billion today. So in effect, the German finance ministry has made money out of the crisis, not lost money.
All right, we're going to pick up on those points when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.